There is water beneath everything. Not the water you see when you look at rivers, or the rain that falls and vanishes into soil. Deeper than that. Older. A kind of water that exists below the foundations of the world, moving slowly in darkness, carrying memory the way currents carry silt. The ancient Sumerians knew this water. They had a name for it. They said it was the place where the world began, and the place where all knowledge quietly waits. And they said that, in those deep waters, something lived. Not a monster, not a distant, unknowable force, but a God who thought before he acted. A God who solved problems the way water finds cracks in stone, patiently, inevitably, without violence. A God who, when the other powers of heaven and earth made choices that would have broken the world, stepped forward and found another way. His name was Enki, and this is his story. Welcome back to the vault of antiquity. Tonight we are descending into the deep waters of Sumerian myth to meet one of the oldest and strangest figures in all of ancient mythology. Not a warrior god, not a sky father or stormbringer, but something quieter, something that moves beneath the surface of every story we've told so far. Let the world outside fall away. There's nothing here you need to remember, nothing you need to hold on to. Just listen. Let the story carry you. In the beginning, the Sumerians said there was no separation. Heaven and earth were pressed together like two hands in prayer, and between them, nothing could grow, nothing could breathe, nothing could move. There was only potential, the dense, waiting silence before creation. And beneath it all, flowing in eternal darkness, was the Apsu. The word itself is ancient, older than the cities, older than kings. It meant the deep freshwater ocean that lay under the earth, the hidden source from which all springs and rivers rose. Not the salt seas that stretched to the horizon, but the sweet, life-giving water that came up from below, cold and pure and impossibly old. The Apsu was not just a place. It was a presence, a vast sleeping consciousness that held the memory of everything that had ever been and everything that might be. To the Sumerians, this was where wisdom lived, where the patterns of creation were kept, where the very blueprint of existence rested in the dark. And when the gods began to take shape, when the cosmos started to pull itself into form and order, one of them made his home in those waters. Enki. He was there before the sky separated from the earth, before the first city rose from the mud, before humanity took its first breath. He was there in the deep, in the quiet, watching the world take shape above him, understanding it in ways the other gods did not. The early myths do not tell us why Enki chose the Apsu. Perhaps he did not choose it at all. Perhaps he was always part of it, the way memory is part of water, the way wisdom is part of stillness. But what the myths do tell us is this: while the other gods built their temples in the sky, while they claimed the storms and the mountains and the bright, burning heavens, Enki remained below. Not out of fear, not out of exile, but because he understood something fundamental. That power does not only come from above, that the deepest truths are not shouted from mountaintops, but whispered in the dark places beneath the world, where the roots of everything grow. Enki was not like the others. When you read the old myths, you notice it immediately. The other gods act with thunder and fire. They make pronouncements. They draw lines in the sand and dare the world to cross them. They are loud in their authority, absolute in their judgments, quick to anger and slow to forgive. Enki does not do this. When a problem arises, Enki sits with it. He turns it over in his mind the way you might turn a stone in your hand, feeling its weight, its texture, the way it fits against your palm. He considers angles the other gods do not see. He finds solutions that do not require violence, that do not demand submission, that do not break what they are trying to fix. This is what makes him strange. In a cosmos governed by hierarchy and force, Enki operates by cleverness, by empathy, by a kind of patient, relentless intelligence that unsettles the established order without ever directly challenging it. He is a rule bender, not a rule breaker. A god who will follow the letter of divine law while completely subverting its spirit. A trickster, yes, but not a cruel one. Not a god of chaos for chaos's sake. Every trick Enki plays, every loophole he finds, every impossible solution he offers serves a purpose. To preserve life. To protect the vulnerable. To keep the world from collapsing under the weight of its own rigid systems. The myths show us this again and again. When the divine assembly makes a decision that would destroy humanity, Enki finds a way around it. When a goddess is trapped in the underworld, Enki crafts mourners who can slip between the cracks of death's authority. When the other gods hoard knowledge and power, Enki quietly shares it, planting seeds of civilization in the minds of mortals. He does not do this because he is soft. Enki is one of the most ancient and powerful beings in the Sumerian cosmos. His word can reshape reality. His knowledge predates the current order of the world. He does it because he sees clearly. He sees that power without wisdom is destructive, that law without mercy becomes tyranny, that the gods, for all their might, do not always understand the consequences of their actions. And so he intervenes. Quietly, indirectly, always from below, from the deep waters where he makes his home, rising only when necessary, only when the alternative is catastrophe. This is who Enki is. Not the strongest god, not the highest or the most worshipped, but the one who understands, the one who thinks, the one who, when the world is about to break, finds the hidden third option that no one else could see. Enki's home was called the Abzu. In some translations you'll see it written as Apsu, but the Sumerians themselves used Abzu, the house of deep waters, the palace beneath the earth. This was not a temple made of stone and cedar. It was something older, stranger. A place that existed at the boundary between the physical and the cosmic. Imagine it if you can. A vast hall carved from living water, its walls flowing and reforming, never quite solid, never quite still. The floor beneath your feet is cool and damp, but it holds your weight. The ceiling above stretches into darkness that no torch can pierce. And everywhere the sound of water moving, not rushing, not roaring, but flowing with the slow certainty of rivers that have been running since before time had a name. This is where Enki dwells. In some myths, the Abzu is described as having chambers filled with treasures beyond counting. Not gold or jewels, though those are there too. but knowledge treasures, the secrets of craftsmanship, the principles of irrigation and agriculture, the words of power that can command the elements, the mess, those fundamental decrees of civilization that determine everything from kingship to music to the art of making love. All of it kept in Enki's House of Waters, catalogued in his perfect memory, waiting to be used when the time is right. But the Abzu is more than a storehouse. It is a living place, a place of creation. The myths tell us that this is where Enki shaped humanity, mixing clay with the waters of the deep, breathing intention into form. This is where he experiments, where he invents, where he solves the problems that the other gods bring to him when they have exhausted their own solutions. And it is quiet there. The chaos of heaven does not penetrate those depths. The endless politics of the divine assembly, the petty rivalries and territorial disputes, the constant jockeying for position and prestige, none of it reaches down into the Abzu. There is only the water and the work and the slow accumulation of understanding. Enki is not alone in his palace. The myths speak of attendants, of minor deities who serve him, who help maintain the cosmic machinery that keeps fresh water flowing to the world above. But even surrounded by others, there is a sense of solitude to Enki, a sense that he operates on a frequency the other gods cannot quite hear. He is beneath them in the most literal sense. His realm exists below theirs, but also in a deeper way. He is the foundation they do not think about, the water table that feeds their gardens, the hidden aquifer that makes their power possible. Without Enki, without the Abzu, the world above would dry up and crack and blow away like dust. But the gods do not often think about this. They see the sky. They see the earth. They see the bright, obvious surfaces of things. Enki sees what flows beneath. And from his House of Waters, working patiently through centuries and millennia, he shapes the world into something that can sustain itself. Something that can endure. Not through conquest, not through domination, but through the slow, invisible work of making sure the deep waters keep flowing, keep rising, keep feeding the roots of everything that lives. There came a time when the gods grew tired. This is how the oldest myths begin. Not with rebellion, not with war, but with exhaustion. The great gods of heaven had created the world, separated sky from earth, established the rivers and mountains and the foundations of order. But someone had to maintain it all. Someone had to dig the irrigation channels, to dredge the rivers, to build the temples and grow the grain. The gods decided this work was beneath them, and so they created a servant class. Lesser gods, divine laborers who would do the endless physical work of keeping the cosmos running. For centuries, these worker gods toiled. They dug, they hauled, they built, and slowly, inevitably, their resentment grew. The myths tell us they threw down their tools. They burned their work assignments. They marched to the gates of the great gods and demanded an end to their servitude. The divine assembly convened. What could be done? The work was necessary. The world would collapse without it. But the worker gods would not return to their labor, and forcing them would tear the cosmos apart. It was Enki who offered a solution. He spoke from his place in the assembly. his voice calm, his proposal almost casual. "Create something new," he said. "Not gods, but not animals either. Something in between. Beings made from the earth itself, strong enough to do the work, clever enough to learn, but mortal, bound to the world in a way the gods could never be. Create humanity." The assembly agreed. But they did not know how. Gods were eternal, made of divine essence, shaped by forces beyond material existence. How does one create something that is alive but finite, conscious but bound to death? Enki knew. He descended to the Abzu, to his house of deep waters, and there he began the work of shaping mortal life. The myths describe different versions of this moment. In some tellings, Enki mixes clay with water from the Abzu itself, kneading it like a potter working at his wheel. In others, he adds divine blood to the mixture, the blood of a sacrificed god, so that humanity would carry a spark of the divine within them even as they remained earthbound. But in all the versions, it is Enki who understands the balance. He makes humanity durable enough to survive, intelligent enough to thrive, but limited enough that they will not challenge the gods' supremacy. He gives them hands that can work, minds that can learn, hearts that can feel joy and sorrow and love and loss. He makes them mortal so that each life will be precious, so that they will understand urgency in a way immortal beings cannot, so that they will create meaning in the brief span of their existence. And when he breathes life into the first humans, when they open their eyes in the deep waters of the Abzu and take their first shaking breaths, Enki does something the other gods do not expect. He teaches them not just how to labor, not just how to serve, but how to survive, how to read the signs of weather and season, how to plant grain and build shelters, how to make fire and weave cloth and brew beer, and write their names in wet clay so that future generations will remember them. The other gods wanted servants. Enki created something more complicated, more interesting. He created beings who could learn, who could grow, who could, in time, become something the gods did not anticipate. This is crucial to understanding Enki. He does not see humanity as tools. He sees them as his finest work, his most complex creation, beings who exist in the space between earth and heaven, capable of both, belonging fully to neither. And from that moment forward, whenever humanity is threatened, whenever the divine assembly makes a decision that would wipe mortals from the face of the earth, it is Enki who finds a way to preserve them. Not because he is sentimental, not because he pities them, but because he understands what he made. He understands that humanity, for all their weakness and brevity, carries something the immortal gods do not have: the ability to change, to adapt, to find new solutions to old problems. They are, in their own way, like him. And Enki protects his own. Knowledge to the ancient Sumerians was not abstract. It was not philosophy floating in the air, detached from the world. Knowledge was concrete, specific, embodied in skills and technologies and social structures. They had a word for these fundamental elements of civilization: the me. The me were cosmic decrees, divine principles that governed everything from kingship to craftwork to the operation of temples. There were over 100 of them, perhaps many more. The me of leadership. The me of warfare. The me of music and art. The me of sexual love. The me of brewing beer and baking bread. The me of writing and record keeping. Each one was a piece of the puzzle of civilized life. And they were all kept in Enki's possession, stored in the Abzu, catalogued in his infinite memory. This made him unique among the gods. The others had power, dominion over storms, over fertility, over war and death. But Enki had understanding. He knew how things worked. He knew the principles that allowed cities to function, that allowed humans to build something more than crude survival. And unlike the other gods, Enki was willing to share. The myths tell us that he walked among the first cities. Not openly, not with thunder and proclamation, but quietly. He appeared as a traveler, as a wise man, as a stranger who happened to know exactly what was needed. To the first farmers, he taught irrigation, how to read the flooding of rivers, how to dig channels that would bring water to fields far from the riverbanks, how to work with the rhythms of the land rather than against them. To the first builders, he taught architecture, how to make bricks from mud and straw, how to raise walls that would stand against wind and weather, how to create spaces where human life could flourish. To the first priests, he taught ritual, how to speak to the gods, how to make offerings that would be heard, how to maintain the delicate balance between heaven and earth. To the first scribes, he taught writing, those wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay, the cuneiforms that would carry human thought across centuries, allowing the dead to speak to the living, allowing knowledge to compound and grow. Every advancement, every leap forward in human civilization, the Sumerians attributed to Enki's intervention. Not because he appeared in dreams or visions, but because he simply made sure the knowledge was available when it was needed most. He did not demand worship in return. He did not require temples or sacrifices or prostration. The other gods cared deeply about these things, about being honored and recognized and feared. Enki seemed content to let his work speak for itself. If humanity thrived, if cities grew and culture deepened, and life became more than mere survival, that was enough. This attitude puzzled the other gods. They did not understand why Enki would empower humanity so thoroughly, why he would give mortals tools that might one day allow them to rival divine authority. But Enki understood something they did not. That knowledge shared grows stronger, not weaker. That raising humanity up did not diminish the gods, it enriched the entire cosmos. It created new possibilities, new stories, new ways of being. The world was more interesting with humans in it, more complex, more alive. And so the gifts kept coming. Century after century, whenever humans reached a barrier they could not cross on their own, Enki found a way to provide what they needed. Not by solving their problems for them, but by giving them the tools to solve problems themselves. This is generosity of a particular kind. Not the generosity of a king who gives from abundance and expects gratitude, but the generosity of a teacher who knows that true help means teaching someone to help themselves. Enki gave humanity the me, piece by piece, skill by skill, until they had everything they needed to build something extraordinary. And they did. The cities rose. The canals stretched across the land like veins carrying lifeblood. The temples climbed toward heaven. The granaries filled with wheat and barley. The breweries produced beer that brought joy to hard days. The schools taught children to read and write and calculate. The workshops created pottery and textiles and jewelry and tools. All of it rooted in the knowledge Enki provided. All of it growing from seeds he planted in the deep past before history had a name. And in his house of waters, in the quiet depths of the Abzu, Enki watched humanity flourish and was satisfied. Not proud, not possessive, simply satisfied that his work had taken root and was growing into something he could not have predicted. Something uniquely, impossibly, beautifully human. But the other gods were not satisfied. They looked at humanity and saw noise, chaos, overcrowding. They heard the constant clatter of human life, voices raised in argument and laughter, tools striking stone, children crying, festivals drumming late into the night, and they found it unbearable. The human population was growing, spreading, multiplying across the land like weeds. And the gods, particularly the great god Enlil, who ruled the wind and storms and held supreme authority among the divine assembly, had had enough. The myths tell us that Enlil called a meeting. He stood before the assembled gods and made his case. Humanity had become a plague upon the earth. They were too loud, too numerous, too disruptive. They showed no proper respect for the divine order. They needed to be controlled, or better yet, eliminated entirely. The first attempt was drought. Enlil withheld the rains, letting the land crack and harden under merciless sun. Crops failed. Rivers shrank to trickles. Humans began to starve. But Enki intervened. From the Abzu, he sent water up through hidden springs. He taught humans how to dig deeper wells, how to find underground reserves. He showed them which plants could survive with minimal moisture. Humanity endured. Enlil tried again. This time he sent plague. Disease swept through the cities, filling the streets with the dying and the dead. The air filled with smoke from funeral pyres. But again, Enki found ways to help. He whispered knowledge of medicine into the ears of healers. He showed them which herbs could fight infection, how to quarantine the sick, how to care for the suffering. The plague passed. Humanity survived. Enlil grew furious. These half measures were not working. Humanity was too resilient, too adaptable. There was only one solution that would be permanent. Flood. Not a normal flood. Not the seasonal rising of rivers that brought rich soil to fields. But a deluge. A cosmic catastrophe. Water falling from the sky and rising from the depths, until every city, every village, every last human settlement was drowned beneath the weight of divine judgment. The assembly of gods agreed. It would be done. And to ensure success, Enlil demanded an oath from all the gods. They would not warn humanity. They would not provide aid. They would let the flood come and wash the earth clean of mortal life. Every god swore the oath, including Enki. But Enki, as always, was thinking. He had sworn not to tell any human about the coming flood. But he had not sworn not to tell a wall, or a reed fence, or the side of a house. And so, one night, Enki went to the home of a man named Atrahasis, a righteous man, a man who had lived with wisdom and kindness. Enki stood outside this man's reed house and began to speak. Loudly, clearly, speaking to the wall as was his oath. He spoke about the flood that was coming, how the assembly had decreed it, how the waters would rise higher than the highest mountain, how every living thing would perish. And then, still speaking to the wall, Enki described how someone, if someone happened to be listening, might build a boat. A very specific kind of boat, large enough to hold a family and livestock and seeds, sealed with pitch to keep the water out, supplied with enough food and water to survive until the deluge ended. Enki spoke to that wall for a long time, and Atrahasis, inside his house, listened to every word. When the flood came, it came exactly as Enlil had planned. The sky opened, and the rain fell in sheets so thick you could not see your hand before your face. The Apsu itself rose, adding its ancient waters to the storm, until earth and sky merged into one endless, drowning chaos. Every city vanished beneath the waves. Every field, every road, every temple. The world the gods had built and humanity had filled with life disappeared as if it had never been. But on the surface of that endless ocean, a boat floated, sealed with pitch, carrying Atrahasis and his family, carrying pairs of animals, carrying seeds of every plant, carrying the future. When the waters finally receded, when Enlil descended to survey the drowned earth and confirm that humanity was finally gone, he found Atrahasis making offerings of thanks on dry land. Enlil raged. How had this happened? Who had violated the oath? Enki stepped forward. He had told no human anything, he said. He had simply spoken to a wall. If a human happened to overhear, that was not his fault. He had kept the letter of his oath, absolutely. Enlil knew he had been outmaneuvered. The other gods knew it too. And in that moment, something shifted in the divine assembly. They realized they could not destroy humanity completely. Not as long as Enki existed. Not as long as he was willing to find loopholes, to bend rules, to protect his creations through cleverness and determination. And perhaps some of them began to think humanity's survival was not actually a bad thing. The world had been very empty during the flood. Very quiet. Almost too quiet. Maybe humans, for all their noise and chaos, served a purpose. Maybe their brief, urgent, passionate lives added something to existence that would be missed if they were gone. Enlil never fully accepted this. But he stopped trying to wipe humanity out. A grudging truce was reached. Humans could continue to exist, provided they remained mortal, remained limited, remained aware of their place in the cosmic order. And Enki returned to the Abzu, satisfied that once again he had preserved what needed to be preserved. Not through force, not through defiance, but through the careful, patient application of wisdom to an impossible problem. This is what Enki does. This is who he is. The god who will always find a way. There is another story about the me, those cosmic principles of civilization that Enki kept in the Abzu. A story that shows us a different side of the god of wisdom. A story where even Enki's cleverness can be turned against him. The goddess Inanna came to visit. Inanna, goddess of love and war, of the morning and evening star, of beauty and terrible violence. We spoke of her in the last episode, her descent into the underworld, her death and resurrection. But before all that, when she was young and newly come into her power, she wanted something. She wanted the me. Inanna ruled the great city of Uruk, but she did not possess the full knowledge of civilization. The me remained in Enki's keeping, locked away in the Abzu. And Inanna, ambitious and clever in her own right, decided she would claim them for herself. She descended to the Abzu dressed in her finest regalia. Radiant, impossible to ignore. When she arrived at Enki's underwater palace, he received her with honor as befitted a goddess of her stature. He prepared a feast. The myths tell us there was food, bread and meat and dates and figs. But more importantly, there was beer. Beer was sacred in ancient Sumer, a gift of civilization itself, brewed from barley and water and thyme. To share beer was to share fellowship, to establish bonds of hospitality and trust. Enki and Inanna drank together. They talked. They laughed. The feast went on for hours, and the beer kept flowing. Enki, usually so careful, so measured in all things, relaxed in Inanna's presence. She was charming, witty. She told stories that made him laugh. She asked him questions about his work, seemed genuinely interested in the deep mysteries he spent his days contemplating. And as the beer worked its way into his divine consciousness, Enki began to feel generous. He started offering Inanna gifts. Not physical objects, but something far more valuable. The May themselves. With each toast, with each refilled cup, Enki would name another fundamental principle of civilization and grant it to Inanna. The me of kingship. The me of priesthood. The me of music and song. The me of sexual desire. The me of wisdom and judgment. On and on, dozens of them, perhaps more than 80 in total, each one a piece of the cosmic order that allowed civilization to function. Inanna accepted each gift solemnly, thanking Enki with perfect courtesy. And she made sure her attendant was carefully recording every single me that Enki granted her. When the feast finally ended, when Enki had given away a substantial portion of his carefully hoarded cosmic knowledge, Inanna took her leave. She gathered up all the me, now hers by divine gift, loaded them onto the boat of heaven, and set sail for Uruk. Enki, satisfied and content, returned to his chambers to sleep off the effects of the beer. But when he woke the next morning, when his head cleared, and he called for his attendant to review what had transpired at the feast, the full scope of what he had done became apparent. He had given away the me. Not a few, not a handful, but nearly all of them. The fundamental building blocks of civilization, accumulated over eons, carefully preserved and distributed according to his infinite wisdom, gone. Handed over to a young goddess in a moment of drunken generosity. Enki panicked. He called for his servant, Isimud, and ordered him to pursue Inanna. Take swift boats. Catch up to her before she reaches Uruk. Bring back the me by any means necessary. The chase was on. Isimud and his crew caught up to Inanna at the first stopping place on her journey. They demanded the return of the me. They told her that Enki had reconsidered, that he wanted his gifts returned. But Inanna had Enki's own words as proof. He had given the me to her freely, in full consciousness, by the laws of divine hospitality. They were hers now. She would not return them. Isimud tried to take them by force. A battle erupted on the water. But Inanna's pilot, her faithful servant Ninshubur, was clever and quick. They escaped, racing toward the next waypoint on the route to Uruk. 6 more times, Enki sent pursuers. 6 more times, they caught up to Inanna. 6 more times, she evaded them through courage and cunning and sheer determination. Finally, she reached the gates of Uruk. She disembarked from the boat of heaven, carrying the me in triumph. Her city erupted in celebration. They had received the gifts of civilization directly from the god who invented them. Uruk would become the greatest city in Sumer, a beacon of culture and learning and power. And Enki, back in the Abzu, had to accept what had happened. He had been outwitted, outmaneuvered by the same kind of cleverness he employed so often himself. Inanna had not stolen the me, she had received them as legitimate gifts. There was no recourse, no loophole to exploit. The myths tell us that Enki eventually accepted this with good grace. He had been bested fairly, and perhaps in the depths of his infinite wisdom, he recognized that spreading the me was not actually a disaster. Inanna would use them well. Uruk would flourish. Civilization would expand and deepen. Maybe this is what was supposed to happen all along. Maybe Enki's drunken generosity was not a mistake, but an inevitability. The knowledge could not stay locked in the Abzu forever. It needed to spread. And who better to spread it than a goddess young and ambitious and clever enough to trick the god of wisdom himself? There is a lesson in this story. Even Enki, for all his intelligence, is not infallible. Even he can be caught off guard. Even he can make choices he regrets in the morning. But the story also shows us something else. That Enki can lose gracefully. That he does not rage or seek revenge when bested. He accepts the outcome, adapts to it, and moves forward. Because ultimately, Enki cares more about the work, the preservation and advancement of civilization, than he does about his own pride. And if Inanna could serve that work better than he could in that moment, then perhaps losing to her was not really losing at all. There is a stranger myth, one that shows us Enki in a different light entirely. Not as the wise teacher, not as the clever trickster, but as someone vulnerable, someone capable of making terrible mistakes. This is the story of Enki and Ninhursag, the goddess of birth and fertility, the mother goddess who shaped living things in the womb of the earth. In the beginning of this tale, Enki and Ninhursag are lovers. They are in a paradise called Dilmun, a pure and perfect land where there is no sickness, no death, no suffering. Water flows from the ground sweet and clean. Plants grow in abundance. It is a place outside of time, a garden at the edge of the world. Ninhursag creates plants in this garden. Sacred plants, each one unique, each one containing specific properties and powers. She cultivates them carefully, shapes them with her divine attention, pours her essence into their roots and leaves. And she tells Enki not to eat them. These plants are not for consumption. They are experiments, creations, works in progress. To eat them would be to violate something fundamental about the relationship between creator and creation. But Enki is curious. He looks at these plants growing in abundance, each one different, each one promising some new experience, some new knowledge. And his curiosity becomes too much to resist. He eats the first plant, then the second, then the third. One by one, Enki consumes all the plants that Ninhursag has forbidden him to touch. And each one he eats changes him in some way, fills him with sensations and insights he did not expect, but also takes something from him, damages something in his divine essence. When Ninhursag discovers what Enki has done, her rage is absolute. This was not a clever trick. This was not a necessary intervention to save humanity. This was simple transgression. Selfishness. The god of wisdom acting without wisdom, driven by impulse and appetite rather than understanding. Ninhursag places a curse on Enki. 8 parts of his body begin to fail. One by one, the organs that allow him to function, to think, to exist in the world, all of them begin to die. Enki, immortal, cannot die, but he can suffer, and he suffers terribly. He retreats to the Abzu, collapsing into the waters that have always sustained him. But even there, even in his own element, the curse continues to work. His body breaks down. His mind begins to fragment. The god who has always been able to think his way out of any problem finds himself unable to think at all. The other gods panic. If Enki dies, if that is even possible, the consequences would be catastrophic. The deep waters would lose their keeper. The cosmic machinery he maintains would grind to a halt. The world itself might unravel. They beg Ninhursag to relent, to show mercy, to save Enki from the curse she placed on him. But Ninhursag is unmoved. He violated her trust. He destroyed her work. He took what was not his to take and showed no remorse. The gods plead. They offer gifts, sacrifices, anything that might sway her. And finally, slowly, Ninhursag's anger cools enough for her to see clearly. Enki is suffering. The suffering is real. And perhaps that is enough. She goes to him in the Abzu. She finds him barely conscious, his divine form racked with pain. And there, in the deep waters, she begins the work of healing. For each part of his body that is dying, Ninhursag creates a goddess. 8 goddesses in total, each one born from her divine essence, each one designed to heal one specific wound. The goddess of the jaw, the goddess of the tooth, the goddess of the arm, on through each failing part until all 8 are created and all 8 begin their work. Slowly, painfully, Enki is healed. The curse is lifted piece by piece. His body is restored. His mind clears. He returns to himself. But he is changed. The experience has marked him. For the first time in his existence, Enki has confronted his own limitations, his own capacity for error, his own ability to cause harm through thoughtless action. The myths do not tell us if Enki apologizes. They do not tell us if he and Ninhursag reconcile. But they do tell us that the 8 goddesses Ninhursag created to heal him become important deities in their own right, goddesses of healing and restoration who would help both gods and humans for millennia to come. Something good came from Enki's transgression. Something necessary was born from his mistake. This is a different kind of story about Enki. Not one where his cleverness saves the day. Not one where he outsmarts the other gods to protect humanity. But one where he fails, where he acts foolishly and suffers the consequences and must be saved by another. It reminds us that even gods are not perfect, that even Enki, with all his wisdom, carries darkness within him. Impulses he cannot control, desires that override his better judgment. He is not a distant, perfect deity. He is complicated, flawed, capable of both great good and casual harm. And perhaps this makes his acts of wisdom more meaningful, because they are not automatic, not inevitable. They are choices he makes again and again despite his flaws, despite his capacity for error. Enki chooses wisdom. He chooses compassion. He chooses to help rather than harm. But the choice is real, and the possibility of failure is always there, lurking beneath the surface of the deep waters. We must speak briefly of Inanna again, of her death in the underworld and her need for resurrection. In the previous episode, we told this story from Inanna's perspective. The descent, the stripping away of power, the death and hanging on a hook, the grief that spread through the world in her absence. But we did not speak enough of Enki's role. And his role is crucial. When Inanna descended to the realm of the dead, she took a precaution. She instructed her faithful servant Ninhursag to wait 3 days. If Inanna did not return within that time, Ninhursag was to seek help from the gods. 3 days passed. Inanna did not return. Ninhursag went first to Enlil, the king of the gods. She explained what had happened. Inanna had descended to the underworld and not returned. She needed divine intervention to be rescued. Enlil refused. Inanna had gone to the underworld of her own free will. She had known the risks. The laws of death were absolute. He would not interfere. Ninhursag went to Nanna, the moon god, Inanna's own father. Surely he would help his daughter. But Nanna also refused. The same reasoning, the same respect for the absolute authority of death. The underworld was not a place the living gods could simply enter and leave at will. Finally, Ninhursag came to Enki. Enki listened to her plea. And unlike the other gods, he did not immediately refuse. He sat in the Abzu in his house of deep waters, and he thought about the problem. Inanna was dead, hung on a hook in the throne room of Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. To resurrect her would violate the fundamental laws of death. No one who enters the underworld can live unless they provide a substitute. But Enki understood something the other gods did not. He understood that laws, even cosmic laws, have textures, have edges, have places where clever application can achieve what brute force cannot. He could not go to the underworld himself. His presence would be too obvious, too confrontational. Ereshkigal would never allow him to take Inanna. But he could send something smaller, something that could slip through the cracks. From the dirt beneath his fingernails, Enki created two creatures. Not gods, not humans, something in between. Beings that were barely alive, barely real. They had no gender, no clear form. They were almost nothing. And that was exactly what he needed. Enki instructed these creatures carefully. They were to descend to the underworld as if they were insects or dust. Too small to notice. Too insignificant to stop. When they reached Ereshkigal's throne room, they were not to demand anything. Not to threaten. Not to negotiate. They were simply to mourn. Ereshkigal, Queen of the Dead, was always in pain. The myths tell us she was trapped in the underworld, unable to leave, forced to rule over the endless procession of the dead. She suffered constantly, and no one acknowledged her suffering. No one comforted her. No one cared. Enki understood this. He understood that Ereshkigal was lonely, that her cruelty came from isolation, that beneath her fierce authority was a goddess who had never been shown empathy. The two creatures descended. They slipped through the 7 gates of the underworld unnoticed. They entered the throne room where Ereshkigal sat in eternal pain. And they began to mourn with her. "Your head hurts," they said. "Yes, your head hurts." "Your heart aches," they said. "Yes, your heart aches." On and on, echoing her pain, acknowledging it, sitting with it without trying to fix it or minimize it. Ereshkigal was astonished. No one had ever done this before. No one had ever truly seen her suffering. In her gratitude, she offered the creatures a gift. Anything they wanted. Rivers of water. Fields of grain. Whatever they desired. But the creatures, following Enki's instructions precisely, asked only for the corpse hanging on the hook in the corner. That piece of rotting meat. That divine body that had once been Inanna. Ereshkigal could not refuse. She had made an offer, and they had made a request. The laws of hospitality, even in the underworld, were absolute. She gave them Inanna's body. The creatures sprinkled it with the food and water of life that Enki had given them. Inanna gasped. Breath returned to her lungs. Blood began to flow. She opened her eyes and lived again. But the law of the underworld remained. No one leaves without a substitute. That part of the story we told before. How Inanna returned to the surface and found her husband Dumuzi sitting on her throne, showing no grief for her death. How she chose him as her replacement. How he would spend half the year in the realm of the dead, and his sister Jeshtanana would spend the other half, so that neither would be trapped there forever. What matters for our story is Enki's intervention. How he found a way around an impossible problem. How he understood that the key to Ereshkigal was not force or bargaining, but empathy. He sent creatures who could mourn, who could acknowledge suffering without trying to fix it, who could offer the simple gift of being seen. This is Enki's genius. Not just that he is clever, but that he understands the emotional architecture of the cosmos. He knows that gods, like humans, are driven by feeling as much as by logic. That isolation breeds cruelty. That being truly seen can change everything. When the other gods said the problem was impossible, Enki found the hidden path. Not through power, not through authority, but through compassion deployed with surgical precision. And Inanna lived again because Enki understood what no one else did. That even the Queen of Death longs to be comforted. There is one more story we should tell. A story about a human who came closer to immortality than any mortal before or since. A story about Enki's compassion and the strange, inexplicable choices that sometimes flow from it. His name was Adapa. The myths call him the first sage, the wisest of all humans. He was a priest of Enki in the ancient city of Eridu, that first city built at the edge of the marshlands where fresh water meets salt. Adapa served in Enki's temple, performing the daily rituals, maintaining the offerings, keeping the sacred spaces clean and ordered. But Adapa was more than just a priest. Enki had taught him things, secret things, the inner workings of ritual, the true names of cosmic forces, languages that humans were not meant to know. Adapa could read the patterns of stars and seasons. He could heal sickness with words. He understood the deep structure of reality in ways that made him almost godlike in his wisdom. Enki had, in essence, created a perfect servant, a human who could think like a god while remaining bound to mortal existence. One day, Adapa was out on the water, fishing. This was part of his duties, to provide fish for the temple offerings. The marshlands around Eridu were rich with life, and Adapa knew these waters well. But as he fished, a wind came up. The south wind, powerful and sudden, capsized his boat. Adapa was thrown into the water, his boat destroyed, his catch lost. He struggled to shore, angry and humiliated and cold. And in his anger, Adapa cursed the south wind. But this was not an ordinary curse. Adapa knew the true names of things. He knew the words of power that Enki had taught him. When he cursed the south wind, he did so with divine language, with cosmic authority. And the south wind broke. The myths say Adapa shattered the wing of the south wind, that he broke something fundamental in its nature so that it could no longer blow across the land. For 7 days, the south wind did not stir. The air grew stagnant. The natural rhythms of weather stopped. The gods noticed. Anu, the sky father, the supreme god who dwelt in the highest heavens, demanded to know what had happened. Who had dared to injure the south wind, who possessed the power to break a fundamental force of nature. When he learned it was a human, a mere mortal, who had done this, Anu was outraged. He summoned Adapa to heaven to answer for his crime. Adapa was terrified. Humans did not go to heaven. Humans did not stand before Anu. The punishment for injuring the south wind would surely be death or worse. He went to Enki for guidance. Enki listened to Adapa's story, and then, carefully, he gave his priest instructions. Advice on how to survive an audience with the King of Heaven. When you arrive, Enki said, you will see two gods standing at the gate. Dumuzi and Jishtada, the guardians of heaven's threshold. These gods know what it is to die. Dumuzi spends half his time in the underworld, and Jishtada walks between life and death as a healer and psychopomp. Show them respect. Mourn for them. Tell them you grieve for their suffering. They will be moved by this. They will speak well of you to Anu. When you stand before Anu himself, Enki continued, be humble. Explain what happened honestly. Do not try to justify breaking the south wind. Accept responsibility. Show remorse. And then Enki gave one final instruction. One that would change everything. Anu will offer you food and water, Enki said. The bread of life and the water of life. Do not eat or drink anything he offers you. Refuse it, no matter how much he insists. It will be poison. A test. If you consume it, you will die. Adapa listened carefully. He memorized every instruction. And then he made the journey to heaven. Everything happened as Enki predicted. Adapa mourned with Dumuzi and Jishtada at the gate. They were touched by his empathy, by his recognition of their pain. They spoke well of him to Anu, calling him wise and compassionate. When Adapa stood before the Sky Father, he was humble. He explained what had happened, the capsized boat, the anger, the curse spoken without thinking of consequences. He accepted full responsibility. He showed genuine remorse. Anu was impressed. This human was remarkable. Wise beyond his years. Honest. Capable of acknowledging his mistakes. And clearly, he possessed power that no mortal should have. Perhaps Anu thought this human deserved something more than punishment. Perhaps he deserved a reward. Anu ordered food and water to be brought. The bread of life. The water of life. If Adapa consumed them, he would become immortal. He would transcend his mortal nature and join the gods in eternal existence. Anu offered the bread to Adapa. And Adapa, remembering Enki's warning, refused. Anu offered the water. Adapa refused again. Anu was confused. Why would anyone refuse immortality? Why would a human, given the chance to become a god, turn it down? He asked Adapa why he would not eat or drink. And Adapa, still following Enki's instructions, said that his master Enki had warned him the food and water would be poison. That to consume them would mean death. Anu understood then what had happened, and he began to laugh. Enki had tricked his own priest. Enki, who always saw 10 steps ahead, who always knew exactly what would happen, had given Adapa false advice. He had told him to refuse the very thing that would grant him immortality. Why would Enki do this? The myths do not give us a clear answer. But we can guess. Perhaps Enki knew that a human with immortality would disrupt the cosmic order too severely. That Adapa, for all his wisdom, was meant to remain human. That his mortality was essential to who he was. Or perhaps Enki was protecting Adapa from something worse than death. Perhaps becoming a god would have changed him in ways that would have destroyed what made him special. Perhaps immortality would have been a curse disguised as a gift. Or perhaps, and this is the interpretation that feels truest to Enki's nature, perhaps he was following a rule we cannot see. A cosmic law that required him to prevent Adapa's transformation, even though part of him might have wanted to grant his faithful priest eternal life. Enki operates within constraints. He bends rules, but he does not break the fundamental structure of reality. And perhaps there was a line that could not be crossed, not even for someone he cared about. Anu sent Adapa back to Earth. He would remain mortal. He would age and die like all humans. But he would also remain Adapa, the wise priest, the first sage, the human who came closer to godhood than any other. And in Eridu, when Adapa returned to his temple, did he rage at Enki for the deception? Did he mourn what he had lost? The myths do not say. They end with Adapa returning to his life, continuing his service, accepting what had happened. Perhaps he understood, in his great wisdom, that Enki had made the right choice. That mortality was not a punishment, but a gift. That living forever would have meant losing something essential about being human, the urgency, the preciousness, the knowledge that every moment is limited and therefore sacred. Or perhaps he never forgave Enki. Perhaps he served the god of wisdom with resentment in his heart, knowing he had been denied immortality by the one being he trusted most. We cannot know. The story ends in ambiguity, as the oldest stories often do. What we do know is this: Enki, faced with a choice between elevating his most faithful servant and preserving the order of the cosmos, chose preservation. He chose to keep Adapa human, even though it meant deceiving him, even though it meant causing pain. Because sometimes wisdom requires difficult choices. Sometimes protecting someone means denying them what they think they want. Sometimes love looks like betrayal from the outside, but is actually the deepest form of care. This is the complexity of Enki, the moral ambiguity that makes him more than a simple hero or teacher. He acts for the greater good, but the greater good is not always kind, not always just, not always what we would choose for ourselves. He is the God who understands that the world is complicated, that there are no perfect solutions, that every choice has costs, and sometimes the cost is paid by those we care about most. And he makes those choices anyway because someone must. Because the alternative is worse. Because wisdom without the willingness to act is meaningless. Adapa lived and died as a human. His wisdom passed into legend. His story was told for thousands of years, carried on clay tablets from Sumer to Babylon to Assyria and beyond. And Enki, in the deep waters of the Abzu, continued his work, continued to make impossible choices, continued to protect the world in ways that no one fully understood. Because that is what he does. That is who he is. We have told you stories now. Stories of creation and flood, of drunken feasts and forbidden gardens, of death and resurrection, and the mortal who almost became a god. But what do these stories tell us? When we step back and look at them together, what pattern emerges from the accumulated myths of Enki? He is not a savior. That word is too simple, too clean. Saviors are heroes who arrive at the last moment and fix everything with power and righteousness. Saviors make the world better through their inherent goodness. Enki is more complicated than that. He is a keeper of balance, a guardian of the space between extremes. When the gods decide to destroy humanity entirely, he preserves a remnant. When knowledge is hoarded by divine authority, he finds ways to share it. When rigid law would break the world, he bends the rules just enough to prevent catastrophe. But he is not soft, not permissive. He does not say that anything goes, that there are no consequences, that everyone deserves to be saved from their own choices. When Adapa seeks immortality, Enki prevents it. When he himself transgresses by eating Ninhasag's sacred plants, he suffers terribly. When Inanna tricks him into giving away the me, he accepts the loss. He understands that even he must live within limits. Even he must face consequences. What Enki maintains is not the status quo, not the existing power structure, but something deeper, the fundamental conditions that allow life to continue, that allow problems to be solved, that allow change to happen without total destruction. He is the God who ensures that when the system breaks down, it does not collapse entirely. That when mistakes are made, they can be corrected. That when conflicts arise, there is always a third option, a hidden path, a way forward that no one else could see. Think about what the world would be like without Enki. When the gods grew angry with humanity, there would have been no flood survivor. No Atrahasis building a boat. No preserved seeds and animals. Humanity would have drowned completely, and the earth would have remained empty forever. When Inanna died in the underworld, there would have been no rescue. She would have hung on that hook for eternity, and the world above would have become barren and cold. Spring would never have returned. When the worker gods rebelled, there would have been no solution. Either the great gods would have forced them back to labor, tearing the divine hierarchy apart, or the cosmos would have ground to a halt with no one to maintain it. Every crisis, every impossible problem, every moment when the world stood on the edge of total breakdown, Enki was there. Not always visible, not always acknowledged, but present, thinking, finding the way through. This is not dramatic. It does not make for the kind of myths where heroes charge into battle with swords drawn and voices raised. Enki's interventions are quiet, surgical, often invisible until long after they have taken effect. He speaks to walls instead of people. He creates barely living mourners instead of mighty warriors. He gets drunk and gives away cosmic secrets, then accepts the consequences with grace. He mixes clay and water in the depths of the Abzu and creates something entirely new. The other gods operate in the light. They build temples that scrape the sky. They demand worship and sacrifice. They make pronouncements from on high that shake the earth. Enki operates in the deep places, in the spaces between, in the quiet moments when everyone else has given up, when all obvious solutions have been exhausted, when the only options seem to be surrender or destruction. And in those moments, Enki thinks. He turns the problem over in his mind like a stone in water, feeling for the hidden crack, the unexpected weakness, the place where gentle pressure will accomplish what force cannot. This is his gift to the cosmos. Not power, not authority, but the persistent, patient refusal to accept that any problem is truly unsolvable. There is always a way, always another angle, always some combination of wisdom and empathy and cleverness that can transform impossibility into mere difficulty. And Enki will find it, not because he is the strongest, not because he is the most righteous, but because he understands the deep structure of things, because he has sat with every problem long enough to comprehend it fully, because he refuses to let the world break when it can be bent instead. He is the counterweight to divine authority, the check on absolute power, the reminder that wisdom matters more than strength, that flexibility matters more than rigid principle, that sometimes the most important thing is simply to ensure that tomorrow comes. Without heroics, without glory, without anyone necessarily even noticing. Just the quiet work of keeping the world alive, keeping the waters flowing, keeping the balance stable enough that life can continue, that problems can be solved, that the future remains open and possible. This is Enki. This is what he does. This is why the Sumerians built their first temples to him in the marshlands of Eridu, where fresh water meets salt, where the boundary between elements creates life. Because boundaries are where he works. Margins are where he thrives. The space between yes and no, between law and chaos, between divine and mortal, that is his domain. And as long as those spaces exist, as long as the world needs someone to find the hidden third option, Enki will be there. In the deep waters, beneath everything, thinking, watching, waiting for the moment when his particular form of wisdom is needed once more. Let yourself drift now. The story is ending, but the presence remains. Enki has not gone anywhere. He was ancient when the first cities rose from the mud, and he remains in the deep waters still. Not as a memory, not as a forgotten deity whose temples have crumbled to dust, but as something that exists beneath the surface of the world, regardless of whether anyone remembers his name. The principle he represents does not age, does not fade, does not require belief to continue functioning. Wisdom still flows through the world like underground rivers. Problems are still solved through patience and cleverness rather than force. The hidden third option still reveals itself to those who look carefully enough. These are not metaphors. These are descriptions of how the world actually works, how it has always worked, how it will continue to work long after we are gone. There is water beneath everything. Not literal water, perhaps. Though that is also true, the aquifers and underground rivers and hidden reservoirs that make life possible on the surface. But deeper than that, more fundamental, the principle of flow, of adaptation, of finding the path of least resistance, of wearing away obstacles through persistent, gentle pressure rather than dramatic force. This is Enki's truth. This is what the Sumerians understood when they made him the god of deep waters. That wisdom moves like water, that it fills whatever container it is given, that it cannot be grasped or held or controlled, but it can be channeled, directed, used to make dry land fertile, to make hard work easier, to make impossible problems solvable. And that it is always there, always available, always flowing beneath the surface, waiting to rise when it is needed. You do not need to worship Enki to benefit from this. You do not need to know his name or his stories or the 1,000 details of Sumerian mythology. You only need to understand what he represents. That there is always another way. That the obvious solution is not the only solution. That sometimes the answer is to step back, to think deeply, to let the problem reveal its own hidden structure. That force is not the same as power. That loudness is not the same as authority. That the most important work often happens in quiet places, out of sight, with no one watching and no glory to be gained. This is the legacy of Enki. Not his temples or his statues or the clay tablets that recorded his myths, but the idea that wisdom matters, that cleverness can save what strength cannot, that empathy and understanding are not weaknesses, but tools as powerful as any weapon. The world needs this. It has always needed this. It will continue to need this for as long as problems exist, for as long as conflicts arise, for as long as rigid systems threaten to break under their own weight. And so Enki remains. In the deep waters, in the quiet spaces between thoughts, in the moment when you see a solution that no one else has noticed, when you find a way forward that seemed impossible a moment ago. He is not a god you pray to for intervention. He is a principle you embody when you think clearly, when you act with wisdom, when you refuse to accept that any situation is truly hopeless. The Sumerians are gone. Their cities are dust. Their language is dead. Their empire has been forgotten for thousands of years. But the waters still flow beneath the earth. Springs still rise. Rivers still run. And the work continues. Problems are solved. Balance is maintained. The world keeps turning, keeps living, keeps finding ways forward even when the path seems completely blocked. This is Enki's gift. Not to the Sumerians alone, but to everyone who has ever lived. Everyone who will ever live. Everyone who finds themselves facing an impossible choice and refuses to accept that destruction is the only answer. There is another way. There is always another way. You just have to be willing to look for it, to think deeply, to consider angles that others miss, to be clever and patient and persistent enough to find the hidden crack in the problem's armor. And when you do, when you discover that third option, that unexpected solution, that path between extremes, you are doing Enki's work. You are channeling his wisdom. You are proving that the old god's truth still holds. That wisdom flows like water. That it cannot be stopped, only redirected. That it will always find a way through, around, or beneath any obstacle. So rest now. Let the stories settle. Let the deep waters carry you. Enki is still down there, in the Abzu, in the house of deep waters. Still thinking. Still working. Still ensuring that the cosmic machinery keeps functioning, that the springs keep rising, that life keeps flowing through the world. He does not need your attention. He does not require your belief. He simply is, has always been, will always be. The god beneath, the keeper of balance, the one who thinks before he acts, who solves rather than destroys, who protects the world through quiet wisdom rather than loud authority. The waters are deep. The waters are ancient. The waters will outlast everything, and Enki watches over them still. Sleep well. Dream of deep waters and hidden wisdom. Dream of problems solved and balance maintained. Dream of a cosmos where cleverness matters more than force, where thinking is more powerful than fighting, where there is always another way. The story is over, but the truth continues. And the waters keep flowing deep beneath the world, carrying memory and wisdom and the patient, persistent promise that no matter how dark things become, no matter how impossible the problem seems, there is someone down there who understands, who sees, who thinks, who will find a way. Rest now. The god beneath is watching, and the world is safe in his hands. Thank you for listening to this episode of Vault of Antiquity. Until next time, may your dreams be peaceful and your rest be deep.